Hook 00020. Sweden builds close to 85 to 90% of its homes in factories. Australia builds under 5% that way. That gap has existed for decades, and nobody in the mainstream conversation seems particularly interested in closing it. Prefab construction, the method that promises to cut build times by up to half and trim cost by an estimated 20%, is still being treated in this country like a temporary fix rather than a permanent solution. Here is what is actually standing in the way. Legitimation 02045. This is not speculation about some future technology. Prefabricated homes have been built, occupied, and praised by their owners across Australia for decades. The barriers are not structural in the engineering sense. They are financial, regulatory, cultural, and logistical, and they are specific, documented, and still active in 2026. Locals who have gone through the prefab process will tell you the same thing. The house itself was the easy part. Everything surrounding it is what nearly broke them. The following 5 blockers are the ones that keep the most cost-effective build method in the country running at a fraction of its capacity. They are not presented as abstract policy problems. Each one has a concrete mechanism that costs real Australians real money and real time, and a few of them are only now, very slowly, beginning to shift. Here is the core problem with financing a prefab home, and it is so structurally strange that once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. When a builder begins constructing a traditional home on a block of land, the bank can look at that land. It is real, it is titled, it is secured against the loan. As the build progresses, the bank releases funds in stages because there is always something physical sitting on that titled block to act as security. The system is not elegant, but it works. Now try to apply that same model to a home being built in a factory, possibly hundreds of kilometres from the land it will eventually sit on. The land exists, the title exists, but the house is not on it yet. For most of the build cycle, the bank's security is a set of modules in a factory shed, which from a traditional lending perspective is barely better than nothing. This is the structural absurdity at the heart of prefab finance in Australia, and it kept mainstream lending almost entirely locked out of the sector for years. The shift came in January 2025, when a major bank, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, began lending up to 80% of the build contract with what it designates as assessed manufacturers. That distinction matters enormously. An assessed manufacturer is one the bank has already evaluated for financial stability, build quality standards, and project delivery track record. If your prefab builder is on that assessed list, you can now access up to 80% loan-to-value ratio on the build contract. That is a genuine structural change. It did not exist before 2025. But if your builder is not on the assessed list, and most builders are not because the list is new and the assessment process takes time, you are typically looking at lending capped somewhere around 60%, or constrained by the equity already sitting in your land. For buyers without substantial land equity, that cap is not a minor inconvenience. It is a deal breaker. It means you need a significantly larger deposit for a prefab build than you would for a comparable conventional build, even though the prefab route is generally faster and potentially cheaper to complete. Ask anyone who tried to finance a modular home before January 2025, and they will describe a process that felt less like applying for a mortgage and more like trying to explain a concept the bank's systems had no category for. Brokers would send them back to lenders. Lenders would refer them to specialists. Specialists would quote terms that made the supposed cost advantage of prefab evaporate before a module had left the factory floor. The honest drawback here is that even with the CBA's January 2025 change, the broader lending ecosystem has not caught up. One major lender moving is significant, but one lender does not make a market. Most mortgage brokers in Australia are still navigating a system that functionally treats off-site construction as high risk by default, and that system-wide lag will not resolve in a single calendar year. The door opened in 2025. What walks through it, and how quickly, is still being determined. Checkpoint. The next blocker does not care about your financing at all. You can solve every lending issue, secure the best rate, find an assessed manufacturer, and still hit a wall that has nothing to do with money. It has to do with where in Australia the house is going to land. Because one factory-built home has to satisfy dozens of different local rulebooks, depending on the postcode. One of the most persistent myths about prefab construction is that building a home in a factory somehow lets you bypass the planning system. It does not. Not even slightly. The National Construction Code applies to prefab homes the same way it applies to any other residential structure. Planning approval is required. A building certifier must be engaged. Service connections, water, sewage, power, telecommunications, all need to be organised and signed off. None of that disappears because the walls were assembled off-site. What makes this particularly difficult in the Australian context is that planning and building approval remain almost entirely state and council-based. There is no national prefab pathway. There is no streamlined approval process that a manufacturer can access once and then deploy across multiple jurisdictions. A home designed and built in a factory in Victoria still needs to satisfy the local planning rulebook of whatever New South Wales council it is being shipped to, or Queensland, or South Australia. Each jurisdiction has its own overlays, its own setback requirements, its own interpretations of what a certifier needs to see. This creates a situation that is difficult to overstate in terms of its practical cost. A prefab manufacturer who has perfected a particular home design, refined the engineering, the insulation ratings, the structural calculations, cannot simply deploy that design nationwide. They must run it through each individual council's approval process as if it were a custom design, every single time. The standardization that makes factory production economically viable gets partially undone by the regulatory fragmentation that governs where the product can actually be placed. Think about what that means for a small or mid-sized prefab company trying to scale. They are running what is essentially a manufacturing operation, fixed overheads, production schedules, supply chains, while simultaneously managing a legal and approval burden that varies across dozens of local governments. The engineering is standardized. The compliance process is not. That asymmetry is one of the structural reasons the industry cannot reach the volumes that would start to dramatically reduce unit costs. There is also the certifier problem, which does not get discussed enough. Building certifiers assess homes against the NCC and local planning rules. Many certifiers, particularly outside major metropolitan areas, have limited experience with modular and prefab construction. The structural connections that join modules, the way a prefab home interfaces with its slab or stumps, the factory-applied waterproofing membranes, these are not identical to what a certifier sees on a conventional site-built job. Some will assess them confidently. Others will slow the process significantly while they build that confidence, at the applicant's cost in time and often in fees. The honest reality is that until Australia has either a nationally consistent approval pathway for factory-built housing, or dramatically more certifier training and experience with the product type, this blocker will keep chewing into the time savings that prefab is supposed to deliver. The house itself can be built in weeks. The approval to put it somewhere can take months, and that timeline does not compress just because the build method is faster. Sweden. It keeps coming up whenever anyone discusses prefab in Australia, and the comparison is not flattering. Sweden has reached somewhere in the range of 85 to 90% prefabrication across its residential construction sector. Australia sits under 5%. Those two numbers exist in the same industry, on the same planet, and the gap between them is not an accident of geography or climate. It is the result of decades of divergent industrial investment and policy environment. The reason scale matters so much in prefab is that the economics of factory production are fundamentally different from the economics of site construction. On a conventional build site, your costs are relatively linear. More houses mean roughly proportional increases in material and labour costs. In a factory, you have significant fixed overheads. The building itself, the production equipment, the trained workforce, the quality control systems. Once those are in place, each additional unit produced costs meaningfully less than the one before it, up to a point. That is the core promise of industrial-scale prefab. The unit cost falls as volume rises. Australia does not have enough factories and does not have enough bank-assessed manufacturers to reach the volumes where that cost compression becomes dramatic. With prefab under 5% of new builds, the factories that do exist are running at scale that cannot compete with what a Swedish manufacturer achieves across tens of thousands of units per year. The math does not work yet. The potential savings, and estimates from sources including the Productivity Commission, and reporting in the Sydney Morning Herald suggest something in the range of 20% cost reduction is achievable, require volume that Australia's current prefab sector simply cannot generate. Victoria has seen more prefab and modular activity than most states, with a cluster of manufacturers operating in and around Melbourne. But even the most active Victorian prefab companies are operating at volumes that would be considered modest by Northern European standards. The industry is not absent. It is just not at the scale where the industrial logic fully pays out. And the chicken and egg problem is real. Banks are reluctant to lend aggressively until there are more assessed manufacturers. Manufacturers cannot scale without better lending access, and without scale the unit costs stay high enough that the value proposition is harder to land with buyers. The other dimension of scale that rarely gets discussed is supply chain depth. A high-volume prefab sector in Sweden has built out supplier networks, joinery, insulation, framing components, fit-out materials that are optimized for factory delivery. Australian manufacturers are sourcing from supply chains that were built for site construction. Some materials arrive in formats that need to be modified for factory production. That adds cost and time in ways that do not show up in the headline comparison between prefab and conventional build quotes. The savings are real, but they are not as clean as they look from the outside. Checkpoint B. Before the next entry, consider that the barrier coming up has nothing to do with engineering, nothing to do with regulation, and nothing to do with supply chains. It is entirely about what a word makes people picture, and the picture it makes them picture has been sitting in the Australian imagination since the mining boom. One image, formed in a mining camp in the Pilbara, still shapes what a bank or a buyer thinks when someone says prefab in 2026. In Western Australia, the word donga refers to a demountable accommodation unit, the kind bolted together in remote mining camps to house fly-in, fly-out workers during construction or extraction phases. Functional, practical, deliberately temporary, designed to be shipped in, used hard, and shipped out when the project ends. The donga became a symbol of Australia's resources boom, appearing across the Pilbara, the Kimberley, and dozens of remote extraction sites throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Here is the problem. In the public imagination, the word prefab and the image of a donga occupy the same mental space. When a buyer hears that a home was built in a factory and transported to its site, the association that fires, even subconsciously, even in 2026, is often one of impermanence, a temporary structure, something that does not belong on a street of permanent homes, something that will not hold its value, something the bank should be cautious about. That association is not based on what modern prefab actually is. It is based on what prefab was used for most visibly in this country for the better part of 2 decades. The same factory method that built thousands of mining camp dongas now builds architect-designed, thermally efficient, structurally sophisticated modular homes. The engineering has moved forward substantially. The reputation has not kept pace, and reputation, in residential property, is not a soft concern. It affects resale value, it affects lender willingness, it affects what a valuer writes down when they assess a prefab home for mortgage purposes. A valuer who has never assessed a modern modular home before, and who defaults to the cultural shorthand of demountable, is not going to write a number that reflects what the home actually cost to build or what it should achieve on the open market. This is genuinely one of the harder blockers to address, because it lives in perception rather than policy. You can change a lending rule with a product update. You can lobby for regulatory harmonization. You can build more factories. You cannot directly legislate what image fires in someone's head when they hear a particular word. What you can do is shift the examples and references that populate that mental space, which is a slow process that requires sustained quality output, media coverage of successful prefab homes that look nothing like a donga, and enough time for those images to crowd out the old ones. There are architects and builders in Western Australia and nationally who are doing exactly that work, producing prefab homes that are genuinely difficult to distinguish from high-end custom site builds. Some of these homes are appearing in architecture media, in award shortlists, in the kind of coverage that signals to buyers and lenders alike that the category has expanded beyond its origins. But it is slow. The mining camp image is durable. Residents who have lived near demountable accommodation, who have watched it age poorly, watched it leak and fade and become an eyesore, carry a memory of prefab that no single award-winning modular home is going to immediately overwrite. The honest drawback is that stigma has real dollar consequences. A prefab home in a suburb where valuers and buyers are unfamiliar with the product type may genuinely achieve a lower resale price than a comparable, conventionally built home. Not because it is structurally inferior, but because the market has not yet priced in the quality. That gap will close over time. In 2026, it has not closed yet, and buyers going into prefab need to understand that the entry cost advantage may not translate immediately into a proportional resale position. Australia is vast in a way that is genuinely difficult to comprehend from the inside, let alone from anywhere outside it. The distances involved in moving people and goods between population centres are not comparable to anything in Sweden, Germany, Japan, or the United States East Coast. The places most often cited as prefab success stories. A factory outside Melbourne can produce a finished module in weeks. Getting that module to a rural block in New South Wales, or a remote site in Queensland, or anywhere in Western Australia that is not within a short drive of Perth, that is a separate operation entirely, with its own cost structure, its own logistics complexity, and its own capacity to eat through the savings that factory production was supposed to deliver. Moving a prefab module is not like moving furniture. An oversized load permit is required. A transport company with the right equipment must be engaged. Specialist lowboys, escort vehicles depending on the route, height and width clearances negotiated with road authorities. Craning the modules onto the slab at the destination requires a crane operator, a rigger, and a site that can actually accommodate that equipment. In an urban or peri-urban setting with good road access, these costs are manageable. In a rural or remote setting, they can be substantial. Substantial enough in some cases to reduce or eliminate the cost advantage that justified choosing prefab in the first place. This is the logistical paradox that nobody in the marketing material for prefab construction tends to lead with. The people most likely to benefit from a faster, lower-cost build method, people buying in regional and rural areas where site construction labour is scarce, expensive, and often booked out months in advance, are also the people most exposed to transport costs that can undercut the value proposition. A cheaper house built in a city factory can cost a fortune to deliver to the bush. That sentence needs to be said plainly because it is true and it matters. New South Wales illustrates this sharply. The state stretches from the coast to well beyond Broken Hill, a linear distance of over 1 to 100 kilometres. A modular home factory in Western Sydney is well positioned to serve Sydney metro buyers. It is very differently positioned to serve a buyer on a rural block near Cobar or Bourke or anywhere in the far west. The transport distance from factory to site in those cases is not a rounding error in the budget. It is a line item that demands serious analysis before the decision to go prefab is made. The cranage cost deserves its own mention. Module craning is not a skill or a piece of equipment that is uniformly available across regional New South Wales or regional Australia more broadly. In some areas, there is one crane contractor within a practical distance. When there is one contractor, there is one price. That price does not have to be competitive because there is no competition. Buyers who have not accounted for this reality, who have budgeted based on the factory price and a rough transport estimate, can find themselves significantly over budget before the modules are even connected. What makes this blocker particularly complex is that there is no single solution to it. Distributed manufacturing, building more regional factories closer to where the demand exists, would help, but only if those regional factories can reach the volumes necessary to operate economically. That requires demand concentration, which does not exist in dispersed rural populations almost by definition. The geometry of the problem resists easy resolution. Some manufacturers are beginning to explore hybrid approaches, producing structural components in a central factory and completing more of the fit-out on site, which reduces module size and therefore transport costs, without entirely abandoning the factory efficiency model. Others are looking at regional construction hubs as an intermediate step. These are serious attempts to solve a serious problem, and they deserve credit for that. But they are early-stage responses to a structural challenge that has existed for as long as prefab has been attempted in a country of Australia's scale. The honest conclusion for any buyer weighing prefab for a regional or remote site is this. The factory savings are real, the build time advantages are real, but the transport and logistics costs are also real and must be budgeted with rigour rather than optimism. Get a detailed transport quote before you commit. Understand what crane hire costs in your specific area. Factor in permit costs for oversized loads on your specific route. The prefab route can still come out ahead on total cost. It does not automatically come out ahead just because the factory price is lower. Those are different numbers, and confusing them is expensive. Close plus CTA, a build method that has been demonstrably viable for decades in some of the most demanding climates on the planet, and still runs at under 5% of the market here. Not because the technology failed, because the surrounding systems never fully made room for it. The question is not whether prefab can work in Australia. The question is whether the finance system, the approval framework, the factory investment, the public perception, and the logistics network will align before the housing crisis forces the answer. Which of these 5 blockers do you think is the hardest one to actually fix? The finance gap, the regulatory maze, the scale problem, the stigma, or the sheer distance of this country? Put your answer below, and if you want coverage that gets into the structural reality behind housing in Australia, rather than the headline number, subscribe.